be talking about AI and accelerating it, but I'm going to challenge us all to actually think a little bit about what I've termed unlearning. And it's actually really thinking about how we look at AI in this world is really not about the technology. And why am I going to not talk about the technology? Pretty sure you're going to hear a lot about the technology. I'm a space engineer by background. I'm happy to talk about tech all day long. I believe in it every day. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what technology means for me, and candidly, a little bit about my side hustle, which is actually training service dogs. Normally, you'd see a service animal with me if I'm taking a little bit of a break from my puppies, but for the past 15 years, I've trained 13 service animals, and they go to veterans or first responders free of charge for the rest of their lives. But what's important to that in this context, as we talk about equity and AI, is what I learned about accessibility and mobility in the life of a service animal. And that anything that we think about accessibility is not always thought about customer first. And when you think about that, when I first actually realized that is whether it's planes, trains, or automobiles, aren't thinking necessarily about customer first. Not always thinking about policy. I heard the last speaker talking about whether it was policy or governance or thinking about how to look at that. But when I first stepped into a rideshare program, doesn't matter which rideshare program, it's happened in a number of them, candidly, I was asked a lot of questions that I should have never been asked. What was my disability? By the way, that's against ADA policy. I was asked a lot of other number of things, including actually being kicked out and told to get and stand on the side of the road. Probably an ineffective thing to be told, not only for someone with a service animal, but in the world of AI, when we start to actually design techniques for automotive machines that are now going to be driving for me, what am I doing now when I have a service animal? So it started me thinking, and I actually went to go meet with a number of rideshare companies, and I actually started talking to them about what they're doing with autonomous vehicles and for service animals. Interesting thing is that many of them hadn't started to think about what to do in the service animal industry and what to do when you actually started to bring service animals in. So I started to ask, what are you doing from a design perspective, and are you actually thinking about design when you start to think about your customer? They actually had not. Now, would it be surprising to you if I said that I started to have this conversation 7.5 years ago? So 7.5 years ago, I started to talk to autonomous cars about what are we doing about service animals. Because for veterans and first responders who suffer with anxiety and PTSD, it's not so simple. Because you know what? They'll never get in a car again. It takes one time for them to actually have a bad experience to not actually do that once again. Interestingly enough, for any of us, when we get into an autonomous vehicle, if we get into it once, we're nervous. If we get into it twice, a little less nervous. 3 times, we'll actually do it over and over again. So the lesson learned is actually understanding your customer to be able to do it and repeat it. But the bigger lesson, I think, is actually understanding how to unlearn what you think is convention and make sure that you truly understand all of your customers to design for that. And that's one of the things I want to talk to us about today is how are people actually understanding all the different ways to design in tech equity? So what are the things that we can build into that as we think about trust? As I mentioned, as we think about AI and what AI is, trust is this funny word. I actually think trust is often overused in today's day and age. But at the end of the day, when we think about trust, trust is about serving people and the people it's meant to serve. And my example, and actually I heard it in the last speech as well, talking a lot about demographics when we think about how coding is developed. Inherently, whether or not you want to purposely or unpurposely think about bias, coding is inherently, depending upon the day of the week, the number always changes, but 92 to 94% of all code is built for white males. Doesn't matter if you're biased or not biased, it just is. And so unless your customer base is for white males, you actually need to think about how you're actually coding for your end user. So when you think about what trust is, and when you think about how you're piloting programs or how you're building for an actual end game, you actually have to think about what that end game is and how you're actually building and accounting for who you're serving and how you're serving for that end game. I often hear about, and I'll ask this audience maybe by show of hands, how many of you are in pilot purgatory? Anybody? Anybody working on pilots with AI? Maybe you don't have to show of hands, but almost every client I go to is stuck in pilot purgatory. They're all like, pilots don't work, AI doesn't work. I'm like, AI works, and as long as I've been in technology, which is now 30 some odd years, there's always been scotch or duct tape in the background holding something together. Always. And that will always be the case. Technology will always work. It's about the fact when you take a pilot and put it to scale, you're putting it into an environment that actually didn't mimic the pilot. I don't care if it's 1700 or it's 2025. That is always the case. What makes it different about AI is that historically, coding has been based on O's and ones, if-then statements. It's actually a learning system that has actually been built on something that's predictable. AI is an unpredictable system. So when you put an unpredictable learning system into a system that you didn't know, it's going to break. When we have to think about that, then how do you actually build a pilot that's put into an infrastructure that can learn with it? And so we actually have some examples where people have actually done that incredibly well. But first, let's take a look at what we actually know is not working. These statistics, again, I always laugh when I actually have to use statistics because I think based on the day of the week, they do literally change. But for glorification purposes, no trust, no traction. Again, if you're not changing the way that you're looking at things, you actually can't make the traction. But we know that actually people aren't paying attention. Public trust in AI changes, again, based on the day of the week. Every time I'm at some place, I see what I call the happy buttons. I don't know about you, I leave an airport bathroom, there's a happy button. Are you satisfied? I don't know, it's a bathroom. I don't know if I'm satisfied. I leave a doctor's office. Are you satisfied? Anywhere I'm at, it's the happy button. I'm like, I have no idea, but I'm losing trust based on the day of the week if I'm happy or satisfied. That number changes based on, is there a breach that happened the day? My other background is I work a lot in our intelligence community. I do a lot with our space satellites. Look, I can get us into a bunker any day of the week. I could get us into a Black Mirror episode. That's not what this is about. But this is about understanding public trust in what we're working on. And if, depending upon whether it be geopolitical incidents, whether it be on cybersecurity incidents, whether it just be on you woke up and you had a bad day, that trust variable changes. But nonetheless, it's important that we have trust in the infrastructure that we're building. The other one is what's going on with the federal government. Also changes based on a daily basis. And so if we know that trust is changing, how do we make sure that we can build pilots that actually evolve with that? So when we think about that, I've got too many buttons here. As I was mentioning, AI is only as effective as the foundation it's built upon. Again, the second question I get, as opposed to I'm stuck in pilot purgatory, is I'm not moving fast enough. I don't know about all of you, but unless I'm a marathoner or I'm running some sort of speed, speed is an irrelevant metric. The second question I ask after that is, have you ever tested your speed beforehand? Usually silence in the boardroom. Why? Because no one can tell me what they do on a speedy day. So I'm like, if you said you're not running fast enough, did you run fast enough yesterday? And usually a CEO or a C-level executive looks at me and they're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you told me you're not doing something fast enough. What does fast mean for you? They're like, well, I don't know. What does fast mean? I was like, I don't know, but you said your AI pilots weren't going fast enough, so what is fast? I say it because if you're gonna say you're not moving fast enough, you have to actually understand what you're measuring. Are you measuring your ledgers not posting fast enough on a quarterly basis? Are you measuring that your product lifecycle isn't moving fast enough? Are you measuring that your development to production isn't fast enough? And if you're gonna say fast enough, quote unquote, what were you doing before? Did it take 6 days, 6 months, 6 minutes? And by the way, remember my comment earlier when I said previously we were O's and ones. O's and ones is not happening today. So you have to actually understand if you're gonna measure something like product development, in today's day and age, again, not sure about all of you, we all want instant gratification. Not sure if I mentioned yellow daisies. I'm pretty sure if I went on my Instagram feed right now, I would see Instagram daisies. It's listening to me. Confident that it is. Instant gratification for product development. If I was a product development company, am I now changing my product development lifecycle? Is my requirement changing? Yesterday's model would be that I'm not doing product development, but maybe twice a year. In today's model, am I doing it every day, every month, every quarter? So now all of a sudden, is fast enough monthly, quarterly, annually? So is my metric right when I say I'm not doing something fast enough? So you have to actually really understand what is the foundation that you're actually building upon. So let's figure out what is an actual blueprint. And it's funny, I actually use the word blueprint. I struggled with this for so long. Everybody wants a playbook. Everybody loves a playbook. I wish I could just charge for playbooks. People want playbooks. I don't believe in playbooks. I don't believe in frameworks. I don't believe in approaches. I'll probably get like fired now because I said that or something. But And I think it's predominantly because, again, in an AI world where something's always learning, and particularly in the job that I'm in innovation, and even in the job that I had before when I was running our cyber business, in a world that's constantly changing, how can you actually build a playbook? Now, you can build something that says what I should be learning and how I should be constantly adapting. But in a playbook, and by the way, this is where I think things break down at times in organizations, is people do want step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, how do I scale that? Again, if AI is constantly learning and constantly adapting, and people want a hierarchy of order, how do you actually create a playbook? I was in a meeting last week, 2 weeks on Capitol Hill, and I was asked, how do you restrict everything? And I was like, wow. I was like, I don't know. I was like, I don't even know what to do with that. And they're like, no, we need you to tell us how to restrict everything. And I was like, my brain was like, I just honestly don't know what to do with that. And I said, maybe we should take a step back, and maybe what you're trying to do is actually the exact opposite of the intent of AI. And I said, I think where you might actually be most restrictive by being restrictive is you're going to stop the most brilliant minds from being able to innovate. And they all stopped and they looked at me and they said, how so? And I said, maybe the most innovative minds will come up with the most creative things just by being able to learn with an adaptive model. And they said, well, we don't believe that. And I said, okay. I said, well, let's go grab a 13-year-old and an 80-year-old and people who can't speak to one another. And they said, well, why would you put those people in the same room? I said, because I guarantee you they'd be able to innovate together, not being able to speak the same language, utilizing AI, and not knowing anything. And we need to be able to prove points about putting very diverse people into rooms to be able to create things that wouldn't be able to do it if they were restricted by a playbook. So part of then, how do you get out of analysis paralysis, pilot purgatory, I need a playbook? I'll give us some steps because everybody needs to have some steps. So here we go. We'll come up with blueprint. Apparently that's an okay word. So define an opportunity and set boundaries. Everybody, if you're going to do some sort of pilot, you can do a pilot. You can create individual areas. Pilot, everybody believes, has to be an end-to-end. You have to do everything all at once. Not true. Pick an area that you can actually do something for and actually amplify that intent behind the actual specifics. Start focused, build with intent, build with context, and actually identify a high-friction challenge. Operational efficiency is table stakes at this point with AI. If you're not doing operational efficiency with AI, you probably should just be able to move on. So as we think about what the goal is, it's not to do everything. It's to do what matters most. Figure concrete criteria, look for value, risk, feasibility, and move on from that. Design with dignity and launch very small pilots to move forward. Again, I think it's the 30 small habits in 30 days. Use that type of mindset as you think about that and showcase 90-day increments. Fundamentally believe in feedback, fundamentally believe in looking at getting that feedback to move forward. A couple of examples as we think about how and who's done that well. Chattanooga, Tennessee. So they had a very, very big problem with, they were just moving and outgrowing themselves too much and too fast and too quickly. And as they looked at that, they didn't know how to actually overhaul their transit system. When they were looking at what transit was, they actually had not enough energy in their energy system. And so as they were looking at underperforming areas, they said, well, we can't actually redo the entire city. It's too much, it's too exhaustive. We don't have enough staff. We don't know how to actually utilize it. So instead of looking at the entire city, they looked at legitimately a 20 square foot mile. That's it. They said, we can look at our most populous area and look at a 20 square foot mile. But they said, wait a minute, what if we only look at a 20 square foot mile? We're going to miss something. So they said, let's look at the most underperforming 20 square foot mile and figure out what we can do. So they did. And then they rerouting everything and understanding everything they could. They realized that people that didn't have phones couldn't use the public transit. They realized that people that spoke multiple languages couldn't get to public transit. And they realized that people that didn't have money and funding that relied on government aid couldn't use public transit. Now, I don't know about you, but the purpose of public transit is for people who actually don't have money and funding. So if you think about the purpose of what public transit for this particular city was supposed to be, actually missed its mission. So the result, they actually saved in that tiny, tiny little pilot. Now, what might not sound like a lot in that initial pilot was $150,000. They were actually able to scale the pilot and went on to save over $25 million. So again, start small, create big scale. Second one, design with intent. Again, this one seems somewhat intuitive, but when you think about what that friction is, I talked earlier about creating friction. I am actually all about creating purposeful friction. I think that's part of my personality, but it is actually about being purposeful. So again, putting these systems into existing infrastructures. Do not create a sandbox that looks like nothing else. Don't create a sandbox that looks pristine. Use stakes that are manageable with constraints that are visible, and actually learn and adjust for redesign as you're moving forward. The other thing that I think is important here is outputs and outcomes. We love KPIs, but we create KPIs that aren't associated with prompt failures. Everybody loves a prompt engineer. Look at prompt failures. How many of you look at the failures that your prompts are creating? I ask a lot of executives, particularly or middle management, and I ask them, I said, how many of you love prompts? They're like, oh yeah, we do our prompts all the time. I said, how many of you actually tell your prompt to check itself? Why would we do that? I was like, because it's wrong 70% of the time. They're like, we didn't ask it to do that. I'm like, check your prompt. Tell your prompt it's wrong. Tell it nicely. If you tell it thank you, it'll do it better the third time. But it's really, really important to make sure your prompts are checking itself. It's more important to make sure that you're actually looking at every prompt failure and behavior change that you're not getting out of that. So again, how do you actually learn from that? So another quick example of France. So we all know the Olympics. We know lots of people that come in and look at the Olympics. We actually work quite a bit as we think about that from a city perspective and looking at France. France was actually really, really nervous. What are we supposed to do with community trust? So many people were coming in. We didn't know how to look at this, the buses, the system, the routing, emergency, what happens? One of the number one things when we do like real-time watches, doesn't matter, it could be a breach. I've done this with a lot of our support systems. The number one problem whenever there's a sense of emergency, no one knows who to call. Systems actually worked fine. No one knew who to call. If there was ever an emergency, who to pick up the phone. So it was interesting. The single point of failure here was literally which phone to pick up. So how do you actually build trust? That friction was, we had a 45-minute debate on who to call. It's like, God forbid that there was not an issue because they didn't know who to call. But we were able to do that very quickly, 45 minutes versus hours or days worth of a disaster that could have been avoided. Next up, build for operational scale. Again, depending upon the day of the week, we get a number that says that pilots aren't scaling. It's a true statistic right now. I think the number is north of 90% of pilots aren't scaling. Again, I would say it's because they're not learning and adapting and because they're not in infrastructure environments that are built like what they are actually creating a pilot for. So if that's the case, how do you actually go and invent that? One of the number one things I typically end up doing with people is creating candy companies out of AI. And I do it because people are limited in what they believe AI could be. Most people believe that AI is there to do prompt engineering. And they're like, what is that? I'm like, I don't know, talk to your prompts like you would a consultant. It's that simple, but also know what you should be able to get out of AI. If AI could be your next value generation, don't just use AI to make operational efficiency simpler. If it processes A plus B plus C, AI is not just about taking B out. AI needs to be about how do I completely reimagine it so that that process doesn't even exist and I come up with net new businesses. Most people aren't even thinking about option B, just not even thinking about it yet. So how do we actually get there? My last example, and then I'll wrap it up, is that Raleigh actually did exactly that. They were having a major issue with heat. I'm actually now based down in Miami. I'm not sure what Raleigh's got heat on Miami right now. But Raleigh was actually challenged with the amount of energy issues that they have going on in heat. And they actually couldn't figure out how to handle it. So they had actually a number of engineers looking at it. They actually built a digital twin to go look at it. And in addition to just having a complete digital twin built around the state of Raleigh, they actually AI-ified all of the digital twin to look at operational efficiencies. What they didn't realize and what they were able to create from that was actually data monetization of all of the data that they were coming, inclusive of satellite data, that they then were actually able to start selling off and creating for water, for energy, and for solar. something that the city of Raleigh had never, ever imagined doing. And now they're actually working with public policy and geospatial environments to actually look at how to create urban planning differently. So again, if you think about what the art of the possible is, it's actually quite amazing when you can think about how you might be able to reimagine AI. So I would tell you, AI and actually being able to have a blueprint is possible. Many cities have been able to show them. I won't belabor my example with New York City, very similar to the Raleigh example, not with heat and energy, as they looked at embedding transparency in their systems as well as they think about moving forward. And ultimately, at the end of the day, designing systems for AI at scale is up to each of you as we think about how to define them. So as I mentioned, define the opportunity in this set forward, set an example for you, building pilots that can set not just tools. If you actually implement just tools and just silos, you're going to end up with that. Independent silos, independent systems, independent data that is actually not just integrated and will not be able to scale. Govern with transparency and accountability, and obviously build for operational scale. So obviously at the end of the day, what choices do we have for a better tomorrow? I'll leave you with one last thing as we think about it with my opening story. As I said, my side hustle, training service animals. Be sure to think about all of your customers. Be sure to think about all of your experiences when you think about things around ethics, particularly when it comes to AI. One iota of a change will not just change your life, it'll change the life of others that you likely aren't thinking of. And actually, at the end of the day, make sure that you're dreaming for a better tomorrow. So with that, thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it.